The sun doesn't forgive in the West, and neither do debts. When Hannah Price collapsed in the dust with her two starving children, she had nothing left but prayers. But the rider who found them that day would change everything. This is the story of a widow with nowhere to go, a rancher with nothing to give, and the summer that bound them together against threats, drought, and a past that wouldn't let go. Stay with me until the end and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The heat was a living thing. It pressed down on the cracked earth like a hand, merciless and wide, baking the western plains until they split open in jagged wounds. The sky hung white-hot overhead, bleached of all mercy, and the wind, when it bothered to blow at all, carried nothing but more heat, more dust, more of the dryness that had turned this summer into something people would remember for years. Hannah Price had stopped feeling it an hour ago. She sat slumped against the back wall of what used to be a general store, her body folded around her children like a shield that couldn't protect them from anything anymore. The store had been abandoned for months, maybe longer, its windows dark and empty, its sign hanging by a single rusted nail that creaked in the occasional breeze. But it offered shade, a sliver of it at least, and that was more than the open road had given them. Her son, Thomas, lay with his head in her lap. He was 6 years old, small for his age, with his father's dark hair and his mother's gray eyes. Those eyes were closed now, his breathing shallow and quick. His lips were cracked, his cheeks hollowed. He hadn't complained in miles. That scared her more than if he'd been crying. Her daughter, Lily, sat pressed against her side, 4 years old and silent. She held a rag doll that had lost most of its stuffing somewhere back in Kansas. The doll's face was faded, its dress torn, but Lily clutched it like it was the only thing tethering her to the world. She hadn't spoken since morning. Hannah's own lips were split and bleeding. Her tongue was thick in her mouth, swollen and useless. The canteen had run dry yesterday. They'd found a creek 2 days before that, but it had been nothing more than a trickle of brown water that tasted like rust and made Thomas sick. She'd given him the last of their food that night, a piece of hardtack so stale it could have been used as a hammer, and told herself they'd find help in the next town. There was no next town. There was only this, a dead store, a dying road, and 3 people the world had stopped noticing. She closed her eyes and tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come. She'd prayed so much over the last year that she wondered if God had simply stopped listening, or maybe he'd been listening all along and had decided that this was the answer. Her husband, Michael, had died 11 months ago. Pneumonia, the doctor said, though Hannah suspected it was more than that. Michael had been sick for a while before the pneumonia took him. Sick in his lungs, yes, but sick in his spirit too. He'd lost their farm in Ohio to debts he'd never told her about, debts that came crawling out of the woodwork the moment he was in the ground. Men in dark suits with papers that said she owed money she didn't have for loans she'd never signed. She'd sold everything, the furniture, the clothes, the plow, the wagon. She'd packed what was left into 2 bags and bought 3 train tickets west with the last of the money. People said there was work in Colorado, in Nevada, in California. People said a lot of things. The train had taken them as far as the money allowed, and then they'd walked and walked and walked. Hannah opened her eyes and looked down at Thomas. His breathing hitched, and for a terrible moment she thought he'd stopped altogether, but then his chest rose again, slight but steady. She touched his forehead, hot, too hot. "Mama?" Lily's voice was barely a whisper, dry as the dust around them. "Yes, baby?" "Is someone coming?" Hannah's throat tightened. She stroked Lily's tangled hair, the blonde strands brittle and dull. "I don't know. Are we going to die here?" The question was asked with such simple honesty that it broke something in Hannah's chest. She pulled Lily closer, pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "No," she whispered. "No, we're not." She didn't know if she was lying. The sun climbed higher, and the shade shrank. Hannah shifted, trying to keep the children covered, but there wasn't enough of her to block it all. The heat bore down, relentless, and she felt herself starting to drift. Not sleep, but something worse, something that felt like letting go. Then she heard it. Hoofbeats. Faint at first, distant but growing louder. Steady and rhythmic, the sound of a horse moving at an easy trot. Hannah's eyes snapped open. She tried to sit up straighter, tried to call out, but her voice cracked and died in her throat. The hoofbeats grew closer. She turned her head, squinting against the glare, and saw him. A rider, coming down the road from the west. He was alone, a dark silhouette against the blinding sky, sitting tall in the saddle. The horse was a big roan, its coat dusty and streaked with sweat, but it moved with the kind of steady strength that said it had miles left in it. The man wore a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, a faded shirt, and a gun belt slung across his hips. Hannah's heart hammered. She didn't know if she should be afraid or hopeful. Out here, a lone rider could be anyone. A drifter. A thief. Someone worse. But she was out of choices. She raised one hand, trembling, and tried to wave. The rider saw her. He reined in his horse about 20 feet away, and for a long moment, he just sat there, looking at her. Hannah couldn't see his face beneath the shadow of his hat, couldn't read his expression. She felt exposed, vulnerable, like a rabbit under the gaze of a hawk. Then he dismounted. He moved carefully, deliberately, leading the horse by the reins as he approached. As he got closer, Hannah could finally see him. A man in his mid-30s, maybe, with a weathered face and a strong jaw darkened by several days' worth of stubble. His eyes were blue, pale, and sharp, and they swept over her and the children with an expression she couldn't quite name. He stopped a few feet away and crouched down, resting his forearms on his knees. "Ma'am," he said quietly. His voice was low, rough-edged, but not unkind. Hannah tried to speak, but all that came out was a dry rasp. The man studied her for another moment, then stood and went back to his horse. He pulled a canteen from his saddle and returned, kneeling beside her. "Easy," he said, unscrewing the cap. "Small sips." He held the canteen to her lips, and Hannah drank. The water was warm, but it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever tasted. She forced herself to stop after a few swallows, though every cell in her body screamed for more. "The boy," she whispered, her voice still broken. The man nodded. He shifted, gently lifting Thomas's head and tipping a little water into his mouth. Thomas stirred, coughing weakly, but he swallowed. Then the man did the same for Lily, who drank with her eyes wide and frightened. When he was finished, he sat back on his heels and looked at Hannah again. "How long you been here?" "I don't know," she said honestly. "Hours? Maybe longer." "Where are you headed?" "Anywhere." The word came out more desperate than she intended. "We were trying to get to Denver, but we ran out of money and food and—" Her voice broke. The man was quiet for a moment. He glanced at the children, then back at her. His face was hard to read, carved from stone and sun, but there was something in his eyes, something that looked almost like recognition. "You got family out here?" he asked. Hannah shook her head. "Anyone looking for you?" "No." He nodded slowly, as if that confirmed something he'd already suspected. Then he stood, brushing the dust off his knees, and looked down at her. "Can you stand?" Hannah blinked. I think so." "Then get up." It wasn't cruel the way he said it. It was matter of fact, the tone of a man who'd spent too much time alone to waste words on softness. Hannah shifted, trying to move without disturbing Thomas, and the man reached down and scooped the boy up in his arms, as if he weighed nothing at all. "Come on," he said, looking at Lily. "You too, little one." Lily stood on shaky legs, still clutching her doll. The man jerked his chin toward the horse. "Can you hold on if I put you up there?" Lily nodded, mute. He settled Thomas against his shoulder with one arm and lifted Lily onto the saddle with the other, moving with a practiced efficiency that said he'd done this kind of thing before. Then he turned to Hannah. "Can you walk?" Hannah nodded, though she wasn't sure. She pushed herself up, her legs trembling, and nearly collapsed. The man caught her elbow, steadying her. "Easy," he said again. "Where?" Hannah's voice cracked. "Where are you taking us?" The man looked at her for a long moment, his pale eyes unreadable. Then he turned and started walking, leading the horse by the reins with Lily perched in the saddle and Thomas cradled in his other arm. "My place," he said simply. "Not much, but it's better than this." Hannah followed, because there was nothing else to do. The man's name was Caleb Hart, though Hannah didn't learn that until they'd been walking for nearly an hour. He didn't offer it. She had to ask. Caleb, he said, glancing back at her. Caleb Hart. Hannah Price, she replied, her voice still rough despite the water he'd given her. This is Thomas and Lily. He nodded but didn't say anything else. He wasn't much for talking. She'd already gathered that. He walked with the kind of steady, ground-eating stride of a man used to covering distance on foot, and he adjusted Thomas in his arms every so often without breaking pace. The road, if it could even be called that, stretched on through the flat, barren landscape. There were no trees, no signs of life, except for the occasional scraggly bush clinging to existence in the dust. The sun hammered down, and Hannah felt herself fading again, her vision narrowing to the space between one step and the next. She stumbled. Caleb stopped and turned. You need to ride. I'm fine, Hannah said, though she wasn't. No, you're not. He shifted Thomas higher on his shoulder and looked at Lily. Sweetheart, can you hold your brother if I put him up there with you? Lily nodded solemnly. Caleb lifted Thomas onto the saddle in front of Lily, arranging him carefully so he wouldn't slide off. Then he turned to Hannah. Get up. I can walk, she protested weakly. Lady, I'm not going to carry you and lead this horse, Caleb said bluntly. Get up. Hannah flushed but didn't argue. She let him help her into the saddle behind the children, and the relief of being off her feet was so overwhelming she almost wept. Caleb took the reins and started walking again, and this time he set a faster pace. They traveled in silence for a long time. The landscape slowly began to change, still dry, still harsh, but with more variation. Low hills rose in the distance, and Hannah spotted a cluster of cottonwoods that suggested water somewhere nearby. The sight of green, even faded green, was enough to make her throat tighten with something that might have been hope. How much farther? She asked finally. Another hour, Caleb said without turning around. Maybe less. Thank you, Hannah said quietly, for stopping, for helping us. He didn't respond right away, then, wasn't going to leave you there. It wasn't much, but it was something. The Hart Ranch came into view just as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon. It wasn't what Hannah had expected. She'd pictured something small, maybe a little homestead carved out of the wilderness. What she saw instead was a working ranch, or what had been one. There was a main house, low and sprawling, built from rough-hewn logs that had weathered to a silvery gray. A barn stood off to one side, its doors hanging crooked on their hinges. Corrals stretched out behind it, most of them empty, and fields spread out beyond that, fields that should have been green and lush, but were instead brown and cracked, the earth split open like old leather. It was a place that had seen better days. Caleb led the horse through a gate that barely hung on its posts and up to the front of the house. He tied the reins to a hitching post and reached up to lift Thomas down first, then Lily, then offered a hand to Hannah. She slid down awkwardly, her legs nearly buckling when her feet hit the ground. Caleb steadied her again, and she was suddenly, acutely aware of how close he was, close enough to see the lines at the corners of his eyes, the sunburn on his neck, the faint scar that ran along his jaw. This way, he said, stepping back. He carried Thomas toward the house, and Hannah followed with Lily's hand clutched tightly in hers. Inside, the house was dim and cool, a relief after the brutal heat outside. The main room was simple but functional. A stone fireplace on one wall, a rough wooden table with 4 chairs, a pair of worn armchairs near the hearth. Everything was coated in a fine layer of dust, and the air smelled faintly of smoke and old coffee. Caleb laid Thomas down on a narrow bed in the corner, then straightened and turned to Hannah. There's a pump out back. Water's clean. Kitchen's through there. Not much in it, but there's cornmeal and some salt pork. He paused. I'll see to the horse. And then he was gone, the door closing quietly behind him. Hannah stood in the middle of the room, swaying slightly, and looked down at Lily. Are we staying here, Mama? Lily whispered. Hannah didn't have an answer. She found the pump where Caleb said it would be, just outside the back door. It took her 3 tries to work the handle. Her arms were weak, her hands shaking, but finally water gushed out, clear and cold. She filled the tin basin sitting nearby and carried it inside, then used a rag she found hanging on a nail to wash Thomas's face and hands. He stirred a little, his eyes fluttering open. Mama? His voice was thin, confused. Shh, Hannah murmured, smoothing his hair back. You're safe. Rest now. He closed his eyes again, and Hannah let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Lily tugged on her skirt. I'm hungry, Mama. I know, baby. Let me see what I can find. The kitchen was small and sparse, just as Caleb had said. She found a sack of cornmeal, a jar of lard, and a slab of salt pork wrapped in cloth. There was a cast iron skillet hanging on the wall, and a wood stove that looked like it hadn't been used in days. Hannah got to work. She wasn't sure how long it had been since she'd cooked a real meal. Weeks, maybe. But her hands remembered the motions, mixing the cornmeal with water, heating the skillet, frying the pork until it sizzled and filled the air with a smell that made her stomach cramp with hunger. By the time Caleb came back inside, she had Johnny cakes and pork laid out on 2 tin plates. He stopped in the doorway, looking at the table, then at her. You didn't have to do that, he said. You saved our lives, Hannah replied quietly. It's the least I could do. He didn't argue. He just pulled out a chair and sat down, and Hannah did the same. They ate in silence, and Hannah fed Lily small bites, making sure she didn't eat too fast. Thomas woke up long enough to eat a little, then drifted off again. When they were finished, Caleb pushed his plate away and leaned back in his chair. He looked at Hannah across the table, his expression unreadable. You can stay, he said finally. Tonight, at least. Tomorrow, we'll figure out what comes next. Hannah felt something break open in her chest. Relief. Gratitude. Something too big to name. Thank you, she whispered. Caleb nodded once, then stood and carried his plate to the basin. I'll sleep in the barn, he said. You and the kids take the bed. You don't have to. I do. He didn't look at her. Wouldn't be right otherwise. And before she could say anything else, he was gone. Shit. Hannah woke in the middle of the night to the sound of wind rattling the shutters. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. Then it all came rushing back. The road, the heat, the man on the horse. Caleb Hart. She sat up carefully, trying not to wake the children. Thomas and Lily were curled up on either side of her, their breathing slow and even. The room was dark, except for a sliver of moonlight coming through the window. Hannah slipped out of bed and padded barefoot to the door. She opened it quietly and stepped outside. The night air was cool, almost cold after the day's heat. The stars overhead were impossibly bright, scattered across the sky like diamond dust. Hannah wrapped her arms around herself and walked toward the barn. The door was open a crack, and she could see the faint glow of a lantern inside. She hesitated, then pushed the door open. Caleb was sitting on an overturned crate, sharpening a knife with a whetstone. He looked up when she came in, his expression unreadable. Can't sleep? He asked. I wanted to thank you again, Hannah said. Properly. He shrugged. Already did. I know, but She stopped, struggling to find the words. You didn't have to help us. Most people wouldn't have. Caleb set the knife down and looked at her. His eyes were shadowed in the dim light, but there was something in them, something tired, something worn. My wife and daughter died 3 years ago, he said quietly. Fever took them both in the same week. He paused. I wasn't here when it happened. I was up north, buying cattle. By the time I got back, he trailed off. Hannah's heart clenched. I'm sorry. He shook his head. Point is, I know what it's like to be alone, to have nothing. He picked up the knife again, running his thumb along the edge. Couldn't leave you there. Wouldn't have been able to live with myself. Hannah didn't know what to say. She stood there in the doorway, the cool wind at her back, and looked at this man who'd saved them without asking for anything in return. We won't be a burden, she said finally. I promise. I can work. I can cook, clean, help with the animals, whatever you need. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. We'll see. Hannah turned to go, then stopped. Caleb? Yeah? Why is the ranch so empty? Where are all the cattle? His jaw tightened. Drought killed most of them, sold the rest to pay debts. He met her eyes. This place is dying, Mrs. Price. Has been for a while now. I don't know how much longer I can hold on. Hannah's throat tightened. Then maybe we can help each other. He didn't answer, but something shifted in his expression, something that might have been the faintest glimmer of hope. The days that followed fell into a rhythm Hannah hadn't expected. She woke at dawn before the heat became unbearable and got to work. There was always something to do, repairs that needed making, fences that needed mending, animals that needed tending. Caleb had a few chickens, a pair of goats, and one milk cow that looked as tired as the land itself. Hannah fed them, collected eggs, milked the cow, and learned to stretch every resource as far as it would go. Thomas and Lily helped where they could. Thomas, despite his small size and lingering weakness, insisted on carrying water from the pump. Lily scattered feed for the chickens and talked to them like they were her friends. Slowly, color returned to their cheeks. Slowly, they began to look like children again instead of ghosts. Caleb worked from sunup to sundown, and Hannah rarely saw him except at meals. He was trying to save the ranch, she realized, trying to coax life out of land that had forgotten how to give it. He dug trenches to catch what little rain might come, reinforced the barn's sagging roof, and rode out every few days to check on the few head of cattle he had left grazing in the far pastures. He didn't talk much, but Hannah learned to read him. The set of his shoulders when he was worried, the way his jaw clenched when something broke that he didn't have the money to replace. The quietness that settled over him in the evenings when he sat on the porch and stared out at the dying fields. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after they'd arrived, Hannah found him trying to fix a broken gate on the main corral. The wood was old, split and splintered, and he was struggling to get it to sit right. "Let me help," she said. He glanced at her, then shrugged. "Hold this steady." She did, and together they managed to get the gate back on its hinges. It wasn't pretty, but it would hold. "You're good at this," Caleb said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "I grew up on a farm," Hannah said. "My father taught me." "Ohio?" "Pennsylvania. We moved to Ohio after I married Michael." Caleb nodded. He didn't ask about her husband, and Hannah was grateful. She wasn't ready to talk about Michael, about the debts he'd left, the lies he'd told, the way he'd unraveled at the end. "Thank you," Caleb said quietly, "for the help." "I told you I could work," Hannah replied. He almost smiled. Almost. Basset. That night, after the children were asleep, Hannah sat at the table with a pencil and a scrap of paper, trying to calculate how long their supplies would last. Caleb came in from the barn and saw her hunched over the numbers. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Trying to figure out how much cornmeal we have left," Hannah said, "and how far we can stretch the salt pork." Caleb pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. "Not much longer," he said bluntly. "Another week, maybe 2. Hannah looked up at him. "What happens then?" "I'll ride into town, see if I can get credit at the store." His expression was grim. "Won't be much, they've already cut me off twice." "What about selling something? The cow, maybe, or—" "Need the cow for milk," Caleb interrupted. "And the chickens for eggs. Can't sell what we need to survive." Hannah bit her lip. "Then what?" He didn't answer right away. He just looked at her, and she saw something in his eyes, something that looked like resignation. "Don't know," he said finally, "but we'll figure it out." Hannah wanted to believe him, but she'd heard those words before, from Michael, and they'd turned out to be empty. The heat broke 3 days later. Not with rain, the skies stayed stubbornly clear, but with a shift in the wind. It came from the north, cool and dry, carrying the promise of autumn, even though summer wasn't finished yet. Hannah was hanging laundry when she felt it. She stopped, a damp shirt in her hands, and closed her eyes, letting the wind brush over her face. It felt like mercy. "Mama, look!" She opened her eyes and saw Lily pointing at the sky. A hawk circled overhead, riding the wind in lazy spirals. Hannah smiled and set the laundry aside, walking over to where Lily stood. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she said. Lily nodded. "Is it looking for something?" "Probably. Hawks hunt for their supper, just like we do." "Will it find some?" "I think so," Hannah said, though she wasn't sure. Out here, nothing was certain. That evening, Caleb came back from checking the cattle with news. "Creek's starting to flow again," he said, setting his hat on the table. "Not much, but it's something." Hannah felt a flicker of hope. "Does that mean the drought's ending?" "Maybe. Or maybe it's just a tease." He poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove. Either way, it's a good sign. For the first time since they'd arrived, Hannah saw something in his face that looked like cautious optimism. But the relief didn't last. 2 days later, just after noon, 2 men rode up to the ranch. Hannah saw them from the kitchen window, strangers on horseback, moving slowly up the road. Her stomach clenched. Out here, strangers rarely brought good news. She called for Thomas and Lily. "Go to your room," she said quietly. "Stay there until I tell you to come out." "But Mama." "Now!" They obeyed, and Hannah stepped outside, drying her hands on her apron. Caleb was already there, standing in the yard with his arms crossed. He must have seen them coming from the barn. The 2 men reined in their horses a few feet away. They were both rough-looking, unshaven, with hard eyes and guns on their hips. The taller one smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Well, well," he said, looking at Hannah. "You must be Mrs. Price." Hannah's blood turned cold. "Who are you?" "Name's Garrett," the man said. "This here's my associate, Mr. Boone. We've been looking for you." Caleb stepped forward. "What do you want?" Garrett's eyes flicked to him, then back to Hannah. "We're here about a debt, ma'am. Your late husband, Michael Price, borrowed money from our employer, quite a bit of money actually, and he never paid it back." Hannah's hands clenched into fists. "I don't know anything about that." "Well, that's unfortunate," Garrett said, his smile widening, "because the debt doesn't die with him. It passes to you." "That's not how it works," Caleb said, his voice low and dangerous. Garrett finally looked at him properly. "And who are you, exactly?" "Someone who's telling you to leave." Boone, the silent one, shifted in his saddle, his hand moving toward his gun. Caleb didn't flinch. "We're not leaving without what we're owed," Garrett said. "Mrs. Price, you've got 2 choices. You can pay us what your husband owed, plus interest, of course, or you can come with us. We've got a buyer lined up who's willing to take your children as payment." Hannah's vision went white. "You... what?" "Indenture," Garrett said casually. "It's perfectly legal. They'll work off the debt, and in 10 years or so, they'll be free." "No." The word came out of Hannah like a whip crack. "You're not taking my children. Then pay the debt." "I don't have any money." "Not my problem." Garrett leaned forward in his saddle. "We'll give you 3 days to come up with it. After that, we're coming back. And we won't be asking nicely." Caleb took a step closer. His hand rested on the butt of his revolver. "I said leave." For a moment, the air hung taut as a wire. Then Garrett laughed. "All right, Cowboy, we'll go. But we'll be back." He looked at Hannah. 3 days, Mrs. Price. Think about it." They turned their horses and rode away, dust rising in their wake. Hannah stood frozen, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. Caleb watched until the men disappeared over the horizon, then turned to her. "How much do you owe?" he asked. Hannah's voice shook. "I don't know. Michael never told me. Her knees buckled, and Caleb caught her before she hit the ground. "Easy," he said, guiding her to sit on the porch steps. "Breathe." Hannah buried her face in her hands. "They're going to take my children." "No, they're not." "You heard them. They'll come back. And I don't have the money. I don't have anything." Caleb crouched down in front of her, his hands on her shoulders. "Hannah, look at me." She did, tears streaming down her face. "They're not taking your children," he said again, his voice hard as iron. "I won't let them. You can't stop them. Watch me." And in that moment, Hannah believed him. That night, Caleb didn't sleep in the barn. He sat in the main room, his rifle across his lap, watching the door. Hannah lay awake in the bed with Thomas and Lily curled against her, listening to the wind outside and the sound of Caleb's breathing in the darkness. She didn't know what was going to happen in 3 days. She didn't know how they would survive this. But for the first time since Michael died, she wasn't facing it alone. The 3 days stretched out like a rope pulled taut, each hour heavier than the last. Hannah tried to keep herself busy, tried to pretend that everything was normal, but her hands shook when she kneaded bread and her mind wandered when she hung laundry. Every sound made her jump, the creak of the barn door, the snap of a twig, the distant cry of a hawk. She kept seeing Garrett smile, kept hearing his words. "We've got a buyer lined up who's willing to take your children as payment." Thomas noticed. He was too young to understand all of it, but children always knew when something was wrong. He stayed close to her, his small hand finding hers whenever she stood still long enough. "Mama," he said on the second morning, "are those bad men coming back?" Hannah's throat tightened. She knelt down and cupped his face in her hands. "Don't you worry about that. Mr. Hart and I won't let anything happen to you." Promise? She wanted to promise. God, how she wanted to. But the word stuck in her throat because she'd learned the hard way that some promises couldn't be kept no matter how much you meant them. "I love you," she said instead, pulling him close. "More than anything in this world." It would have to be enough. Caleb spent those 3 days preparing. Hannah watched him work with a grim determination that was both frightening and reassuring. He cleaned his rifle twice, checked every round of ammunition he had, and spent an entire afternoon reinforcing the doors and shutters on the house. When she asked what he was doing, he just said, "Making sure we're ready." Ready for what? Whatever comes. On the evening of the second day, he rode into town. He didn't tell Hannah where he was going, but she knew. She watched him disappear down the road and spent the next 4 hours pacing the floor, jumping at every shadow, until she finally saw him return just after dark. He looked exhausted and angry. "What happened?" Hannah asked as he dismounted. Caleb led the horse to the barn without answering. Hannah followed him inside, watching as he unsaddled the roan and rubbed it down with more force than necessary. "Caleb." He finally stopped and turned to face her. "Talk to the sheriff." Hannah's heart leaped. "And?" "He says there's nothing he can do unless they actually break the law. Says debt collection is a civil matter, not criminal." Caleb's jaw was so tight, Hannah could see the muscle jumping. "I told him they threatened to take your children. You know what he said? He said if there's a legitimate debt, they have the right to pursue payment. But they can't just take children. That can't be legal." "It is if the debt's real and documented. Indenture contracts are binding in this territory." He threw the brush into a bucket with enough force to make Hannah flinch. "I asked him to ride out here tomorrow. Be here when they show up. He said he doesn't have time to mediate business disputes." Hannah felt the last thread of hope snap. "So we're on our own." "We've always been on our own." Caleb moved past her toward the barn door, then stopped. "I also stopped by the bank, asked about a loan." "What did they say?" His laugh was bitter. "They said I'm already too far in debt. They're not giving me another cent." He looked at her, and in the lamplight his eyes were shadowed and hard. "I tried, Hannah. I tried every legitimate way I could think of." "I know," she whispered. "Thank you for trying." He nodded once and walked out into the darkness. Hannah stood alone in the barn, surrounded by the smell of hay and horse and her own fear, and wondered what would happen when legitimate ways ran out. That night she couldn't sleep. She lay in the bed with Thomas and Lily pressed against her sides, their breathing soft and even, and stared at the ceiling. Through the open door to the main room, she could see Caleb sitting in the same position as the night before, rifle across his lap, face turned toward the door, waiting. She must have drifted off at some point because she woke suddenly to the sound of Lily crying. "Shh, baby, what's wrong?" Hannah gathered her daughter into her arms, feeling the trembling in her small body. "Bad dream," Lily sobbed. "The bad men came and took Tommy away, and I couldn't find you, and—" "It was just a dream," Hannah murmured, rocking her. "Just a dream. You're safe." But even as she said it, she wondered if she was lying. Thomas stirred, woken by his sister's crying. He sat up and rubbed his eyes. "Is it morning?" "Not yet. Go back to sleep." "I'm not tired." He looked toward the main room where Caleb sat. "Why is Mr. Hart sleeping in the chair again?" "He's keeping watch." "Why?" Hannah hesitated. She'd tried to shield them from the worst of it, but maybe that was a mistake. Maybe they needed to know. "Remember those men who came the other day?" Both children nodded, their eyes wide in the darkness. "They might come back, and Mr. Hart wants to make sure we're safe if they do." "Are they going to hurt us?" Thomas asked, his voice very small. "No," Hannah said firmly. "No, they're not, because Mr. Hart and I won't let them." Lily clutched her rag doll tighter. "I don't like them." I know, sweetheart. I don't either. They lay back down, but Hannah could tell neither of them would sleep easily. She held them close and sang softly, an old lullaby her mother had sung to her, about mockingbirds and diamond rings. Her voice cracked on some of the notes, but she kept singing until both children's breathing slowed and deepened. When she finally stopped, she looked up and saw Caleb standing in the doorway. She didn't know how long he'd been there. "That was nice," he said quietly. "The song. My mother taught it to me." He nodded, then hesitated. "You should try to sleep. Tomorrow's going to be hard." "I can't." "I know, but try anyway." He turned to go, and Hannah spoke without thinking. "Caleb?" He paused. "What are we going to do?" In the darkness, she couldn't see his expression, but she heard the steel in his voice when he answered. "We're going to protect your children, whatever it takes." The way he said it, the absolute certainty, sent a chill down Hannah's spine, because she understood what he meant by whatever it takes. She understood that there were lines he was willing to cross that she hadn't fully considered yet, and God help her, she was grateful for it. Morning came too quickly and too slowly all at once. Hannah woke before dawn and made coffee with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. She burned the eggs she was trying to fry and had to start over. Caleb came in from the barn where he'd apparently spent the last hour checking and rechecking his guns. "They'll come around noon," he said, accepting the cup of coffee she offered. "That's when men like that always come. Hot enough to make people tired, early enough to still have the whole day ahead if things go wrong." Hannah sat down across from him. "Have you done this before? Faced down men like this?" "Once or twice." He took a sip of coffee. "I was a deputy for a few years before I bought this place. Saw my share of trouble." "What happened?" "I stopped being a deputy." He didn't elaborate, and Hannah didn't push. Some stories were meant to stay buried. They ate breakfast in silence. The children picked at their food, sensing the tension, and Hannah didn't force them to finish. When the meal was done, Caleb stood and looked at her. "I want you and the kids in the back room when they get here. Keep the door closed and don't come out unless I tell you to." "No." He frowned. "Hannah." "No," she repeated, standing to face him. "This is my problem, not yours. I won't hide while you deal with it alone. You have to think about the children." "I am thinking about them, and they need to see that their mother doesn't run and hide when things get hard." Her voice shook, but held firm. "I'll keep them inside, away from the windows. But I'm not locking myself in a back room like a coward." Caleb studied her for a long moment. Then, surprisingly, he nodded. "All right, but you do exactly what I tell you when the time comes. Understood?" "Understood." The morning dragged on. Hannah kept the children occupied with small tasks. Thomas helped her sweep the floor. Lily folded cloths that didn't need folding. Caleb positioned himself on the front porch, sitting in one of the weathered chairs with his rifle across his knees. He looked relaxed, but Hannah could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes never stopped scanning the horizon. 11 o'clock came and went. Then 11:30. At a noon, Caleb stood up. "They're coming," he called. Hannah's heart lurched. She moved to the window and saw them, two riders in the distance, moving at an easy pace. Garrett and Boone, just as before. "Thomas! Lily! Come here!" She gathered them close, positioned herself in the corner where she could see out, but where they'd be partially shielded by the wall. "Stay quiet now. No matter what happens, stay quiet." Thomas nodded seriously. Lily pressed her face against Hannah's side. Outside, the hoofbeats grew louder, then stopped. "Well, well," came Garrett's voice, carrying clearly through the open door. "Looks like you were waiting for us, Hart. That's real hospitable." "State your business and move on," Caleb said flatly. "You know our business. We're here for what's owed." "Mrs. Price doesn't have any money. You can see that for yourself." "Then I guess we'll have to take alternative payment." There was movement, the sound of saddle leather creaking. "Bring out the children, Mrs. Price. Let's get this over with." Hannah's arms tightened around Thomas and Lily. "Not happening," Caleb said. "Now, Hart, let's be reasonable about this." "I said no." The temperature in Garrett's voice dropped 20 degrees. "You're making a mistake." "Won't be my first." There was a long pause. Hannah could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. She eased closer to the window, just enough to see Caleb standing at the edge of the porch, his rifle held loosely in one hand. Garrett had dismounted and stood about 15 feet away, his hand resting on his gun belt. Boone was still on his horse, but his posture had changed, alert, ready. "Tell you what," Garrett said, his tone conversational now. "I'm a reasonable man. Let's talk about this. Maybe we can work something out." "Nothing to work out. The woman doesn't owe you anything." "Oh, but she does." "I've got the papers right here." Garrett reached into his vest pocket slowly, pulling out a folded document. "Want to see them? All legal and proper. Michael Price borrowed $2,000 from Mr. Jacobson in Kansas City, never paid back a cent. The debt transfers to his widow. Let me see those papers. Come on down here and I'll show you." Caleb didn't move. "Throw them up here," Garrett smiled. "That's not very trusting of you." "I don't trust you?" "Smart man." Garrett refolded the papers and put them back in his pocket. "But here's the thing, Hart. Legal or not, I'm leaving here today with something. Either money, the children, or—" He paused meaningfully. "We can take it up with you instead, and I don't think that'll end well for anybody." "Is that a threat?" "That's a promise." The air felt charged, electric. Hannah's hands were sweating. She wanted to call out to tell them to just take whatever she had, her wedding ring, the few coins hidden in her bag, anything. But she knew it wouldn't be enough. $2,000 might as well have been $2 million. "Boone," Garrett said quietly, "why don't you go around back? Make sure nobody slips out that way." Boone started to turn his horse, and Caleb moved. The rifle came up smooth and fast, aimed square at Garrett's chest. "Tell your friend to stay put," Caleb said, his voice deadly calm. "Or this gets ugly real quick." Garrett's hand moved toward his gun. "Don't." Caleb's finger was on the trigger. "I can put a round through you before you clear leather. You know I can." Garrett froze. For a long moment nobody moved. Then Garrett slowly raised his hands, showing empty palms. "All right," he said. "All right. No need for anybody to get shot. Boone, hold up." Boone stopped but didn't look happy about it. "Here's how this is going to work," Caleb said. "You're going to get back on your horse, both of you, and you're going to ride out of here. If you come back, I'll shoot you on sight. If you send someone else, I'll shoot them too. This isn't a negotiation, it's a statement of fact." Garrett's smile was gone now, replaced by something cold and hard. "You can't watch them every hour of every day, Hart. Eventually, you'll slip up, and when you do, when I do, you'll already be in the ground. Now move." For a terrible second, Hannah thought Garrett would draw anyway, thought this would end in blood and gunfire right here in the dusty yard. But then Garrett took a step back toward his horse. "You're making a powerful enemy," he said. "Already got plenty of those. One more won't make much difference." Garrett swung into his saddle, his movements tight with controlled anger. "This isn't over." "Yeah, it is." 3 days, Garrett said, looking past Caleb toward the house, toward where he knew Hannah was watching. "We gave you 3 days. You had your chance to do this easy. What comes next is on you." He wheeled his horse around and spurred it hard. Boone followed, and the two of them galloped away, dust rising in their wake like smoke. Caleb stood motionless until they disappeared from sight. Then his shoulders sagged, just for a moment, before he straightened again and came back inside. Hannah was trembling. She couldn't seem to stop. "It's all right," Caleb said, though his face said otherwise. "They're gone." "For now." Hannah's voice came out thin and reedy. "But they'll be back. You heard him." "I know. So what do we do?" Caleb set his rifle down and ran a hand through his hair. He looked tired, older than he had 3 days ago. "We prepare, and we hope they're smart enough to cut their losses and move on. And if they're not," he met her eyes, "then we fight." Thomas suddenly burst into tears. The fear he'd been holding back finally broke through, and he clung to Hannah, his small body shaking. Lily started crying too, though Hannah wasn't sure she even knew why. "Shh," Hannah murmured, holding them both. "It's okay. You're safe. I promise." But she could feel Caleb's eyes on her, and she knew he was thinking the same thing she was. That it wasn't okay, that they weren't safe, that her promise might be one more lie in a long line of lies the world had told them. That night, Caleb didn't even pretend to sleep in the barn. He dragged a chair to the window and sat there with his rifle, watching the darkness. Hannah lay with the children until they finally cried themselves to sleep, exhausted by fear and confusion. Then she got up and walked into the main room. "You should rest," she said quietly. "Can't." "Caleb, you haven't slept properly in 3 days. I'll sleep when this is over." Hannah pulled another chair close and sat down beside him. For a while they were both silent, watching the moon rise over the empty fields. "Why are you doing this?" she asked finally. "What do you mean?" "Risking your life, your ranch, everything, for people you barely know." He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "I told you about my wife and daughter." "Yes." "What I didn't tell you is that I wasn't a good husband or a good father." His voice was low, rough. "I was always working, always chasing the next thing. More land, more cattle, more money. Thought that's what made a man successful. Thought I had time to slow down later, spend time with them later." Hannah waited. "When they got sick, I wasn't here, and by the time I got back—" He stopped, swallowed hard. "My daughter's name was Sarah. She was 4 years old, and the last thing I said to her before I left was that I was too busy to play with her." "Oh, Caleb. I can't bring them back. Can't undo what I failed to do." He turned to look at her, and in the moonlight his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "But I can do this. I can stand between you and those men. I can protect your children even if I couldn't protect my own." Hannah's throat ached. She reached out and took his hand, rough and calloused, and held it tight. "You're a good man," she said. "No, but maybe I'm trying to be." They sat like that for a long time, holding hands in the darkness, two broken people trying to hold the line against a world that wanted to break them further. The days that followed were strange. Life continued, chores had to be done, animals had to be fed, children had to be cared for. But it all happened under a shadow of waiting. Waiting for Garrett and Boone to come back. Waiting for the other shoe to drop. A week passed, then 2. Hannah started to hope very carefully that maybe it was over, that maybe Garrett had decided they weren't worth the trouble after all. Then one morning she woke to find Caleb already up, standing at the window with his rifle. "What is it?" she asked, her stomach clenching. "Rider coming, just one." Hannah quickly dressed and joined him at the window. Sure enough, a lone horseman was approaching, but it wasn't Garrett or Boone. This was someone else, older, wearing a star on his vest. "That's the sheriff," Caleb said, his voice carefully neutral. They went out onto the porch together. The sheriff, a heavy-set man in his 50s with a gray mustache, reined in his horse and touched the brim of his hat. "Hart, Mrs. Price." "Sheriff Donnelly," Caleb said. "What brings you out here?" "Need to talk to you both." He dismounted stiffly. "Mind if I come inside?" Caleb hesitated, then stepped aside. "Come on in." They settled around the kitchen table, Hannah, Caleb, and the sheriff. Thomas and Lily peeked out from the back room until Hannah shooed them away. Sheriff Donnelly pulled out a piece of paper and set it on the table. "Got a complaint filed against you, Hart. Garrett Reed says you threatened him and his associate with deadly force. Says he was conducting legitimate business and you ran him off at gunpoint." Caleb's expression didn't change. "That what he says, is it?" "That's what he says. Also says Mrs. Price here owes his employer a considerable sum of money." "Michael Price owed money," Hannah interjected. "Not me." "Well now, that's where it gets complicated." The sheriff pulled out another paper. "According to this, you co-signed on one of the loans." Hannah felt the blood drain from her face. "What? No, Michael never asked me to." "There's a signature here that looks an awful lot like yours." He pushed the paper across the table. Hannah looked at it, and her vision swam. There was her name, or something close to it. The handwriting wasn't quite right, but close enough that if you didn't know better. "That's not my signature," she said, but her voice shook. "You sure about that?" "I'm sure. I never signed anything for Michael. He handled all the finances. I didn't even know about these debts until after he died." The sheriff sat back in his chair. "Mrs. Price, I'm inclined to believe you, but the thing is, this is a civil matter. If Reed's employer wants to pursue this in court, that's between you and them. What I care about is the fact that Hart here pulled a gun on them." "They threatened to take her children," Caleb said quietly. What would you have done? I'd have come to me. Let the law handle it. I tried. You said there was nothing you could do. Donnelly had the grace to look uncomfortable. That's not exactly what I said. It's close enough. The sheriff sighed and stood up. Look, Hart, I know you're trying to do right here, but you can't just go around threatening people, even if they're in the wrong. Next time something like this happens, you come find me first. Let me deal with it proper. And if there isn't time, then you do what you have to do, but you better be damn sure you're on the right side of it. He looked at Hannah. Mrs. Price, I'd suggest you find yourself a lawyer. Get those papers looked at by someone who knows what they're talking about. If that signature's forged, you've got a case. I don't have money for a lawyer, Hannah said quietly. There's a fellow in town named Adams. Does some work pro bono for folks in tough situations. Might be worth talking to him. Thank you, Hannah whispered. After the sheriff left, Hannah sat at the table with her head in her hands. Caleb stood by the stove, arms crossed, looking out the window. They forged my signature, Hannah said. Michael or his creditors or someone. They made it look like I was responsible for his debts. Probably Michael, Caleb said grimly. Men in deep tend to do desperate things. How could he do that to me, to his own children? Fear makes people cruel, makes them selfish. He turned to look at her. But that means this document isn't legal, which means they can't collect. Unless they convince a judge it's real. Then we make sure they don't. Hannah looked up at him. The sheriff said I should get a lawyer. But even if this Adams fellow helps me for free, it'll take time. Months, maybe. And what do we do in the meantime? We stay careful, stay ready. His jaw tightened, and we don't let our guard down for a second. The meeting with the lawyer happened 3 days later. Caleb drove them into town in his wagon, the one he usually reserved for hauling supplies. Hannah sat beside him on the bench, wearing her only decent dress. Faded blue calico that she'd mended so many times the seams showed white against the fabric. Thomas and Lily sat in the back, unusually quiet, watching the landscape roll past. It was the first time Hannah had been to town since arriving at the ranch. The settlement was small, barely more than a main street with wooden buildings slouching against each other like tired old men. A general store, a saloon, a church with a crooked steeple, and a handful of houses scattered around the edges. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business before breakfast. Caleb pulled the wagon up in front of a narrow building with a hand-painted sign that read, J. Adams, Attorney at Law. He helped Hannah down, and she noticed the way people watched from doorways and windows. News traveled fast in places like this, and she was certain everyone knew about the widow staying at Hart's ranch, about the men who'd come looking for her, about the confrontation that had brought the sheriff out. You want me to come in with you? Caleb asked. Hannah shook her head. Stay with the children. I need to do this myself. He nodded, but didn't look happy about it. I'll be right here. The lawyer's office was cramped and cluttered, every surface covered with papers and law books that looked older than the town itself. Mr. Adams was a thin man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers, probably in his 40s but worn down by hard years. He stood when Hannah entered and gestured to a chair across from his desk. Mrs. Price, I presume Sheriff Donnelly mentioned you might be coming by. Thank you for seeing me, Mr. Adams. I should tell you up front that I don't have money to pay you. The sheriff mentioned that too. Sit down, please. Let's see what we're dealing with before we worry about payment. Hannah sat and pulled the folded document from her bag. The one Sheriff Donnelly had shown her, which she'd asked to keep. She handed it to Adams, and he unfolded it carefully, studying it through his spectacles. This is a promissory note, he said after a moment. $2,000 borrowed from a Mr. Jacobson of Kansas City, dated April of last year. Your husband's signature here, and he paused. What purports to be yours as co-signer? It's not mine. You're certain? Yes. My husband never asked me to sign any papers. He handled all our finances. I didn't even know he'd borrowed money until after he died. Adams pulled out a magnifying glass and examined the signature more closely. The hand is similar to the signature on the documents you brought, your marriage certificate and such. But there are inconsistencies. See here? The way the H is formed. And the pressure of the pen, it's different. Hope flickered in Hannah's chest. So it's forged? I believe so, yes, but proving it to a judge is another matter entirely. He set down the magnifying glass and looked at her seriously. Mrs. Price, even if we can demonstrate forgery, you're still in a difficult position. Your husband did borrow this money. Someone has to pay it back. But I don't have anything. They took everything when Michael died. And these men, Garrett Reed and his associate, what exactly did they threaten? Hannah's hands clenched in her lap. They said if I couldn't pay the debt, they'd take my children, put them in indenture to work it off. Adams's face darkened. That's not quite legal, though it exists in a gray area of the law. Technically, if a debt can't be satisfied through conventional means, the courts can order indentured servitude for adults. Children are a different matter. They'd need to prove you're an unfit mother unable to provide for them, and even then. He trailed off, shaking his head. It's murky territory. Most judges wouldn't allow it. Most judges, Hannah repeated. But not all. Not all, he admitted. If Jacobson has friends in the right places, if he can get the case before a sympathetic judge, it's possible. The hope that had flickered moments ago dimmed. So what do I do? We file a motion to contest the debt based on the forged signature. We request a handwriting expert to examine the document, and we pray that we get a fair hearing. He leaned back in his chair. But Mrs. Price, I'll be honest with you, this will take time, months, possibly a year, and in the meantime, these men aren't going to simply wait around. Caleb, Mr. Hart, he won't let them take my children. Hart's a good man, knew his wife, God rest her soul, but going up against professional debt collectors, Adams shook his head. That's a dangerous game. One wrong move and he could end up dead or in prison. Then what would you have me do? Just surrender? No, but I want you to understand the stakes. He pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and dipped his pen in ink. I'll file the necessary paperwork. It'll take a few weeks to get a court date. In the meantime, you need to be very careful. Don't sign anything. Don't agree to anything. And for God's sake, don't let those men near your children without witnesses present. Hannah left the office feeling somehow both better and worse. Better because someone was finally helping her. Worse because she now understood just how precarious her situation really was. Caleb took one look at her face and knew it hadn't gone well. What did he say? He asked as they climbed back into the wagon. Hannah waited until they were out of town, until the children were distracted by watching a hawk circle overhead, before she answered in a low voice. He said the signature is probably forged, but proving it will take months. And in the meantime, she couldn't finish. Caleb's hands tightened on the reins. In the meantime, we watch our backs. They rode in silence for a while, the wagon creaking over the rutted road. The sun was high and hot, but there was a breeze now, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. Hannah closed her eyes and tried to imagine a future where this was all behind them, where her children were safe and the threats had faded into memory. It seemed impossible. Mama? Thomas's voice from the back of the wagon. Can we stop by the creek, the one Mr. Hart told us about? Hannah glanced at Caleb, who shrugged. It's a bit out of the way, but we've got time. Please? Lily added. We've been so good. They had been good. They'd been terrified and confused and impossibly brave, and they deserved something normal, something that felt like childhood again. All right, Hannah said, just for a little while. Caleb turned the wagon off the main road onto a narrow track that wound through a stand of cottonwoods. The trees grew thicker here, their leaves rustling in the breeze, and suddenly they emerged into a small clearing where a creek ran over smooth stones. It wasn't much, barely a trickle compared to the rivers back east, but it was clear and cold and beautiful. The children scrambled down from the wagon and ran to the water's edge, laughing and splashing each other. It was the first time Hannah had heard them laugh in weeks, and the sound made her throat tight. Caleb set the brake and climbed down, then offered Hannah his hand. She took it, and they stood together watching Thomas and Lily play. They're good kids, Caleb said quietly. They are. They've been through so much. They're strong, like their mother. Hannah shook her head. I don't feel strong. I feel like I'm barely holding on. That's what strong looks like sometimes. Just holding on when everything's falling apart. They were standing very close, and Hannah became suddenly aware of it. The warmth of him beside her, the calluses on the hand that still held hers, the way he smelled like leather and horses, and something uniquely him. She looked up and found him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Caleb, look, look, Mama!" Thomas was holding up a smooth river stone, his face bright with excitement. "Can I keep it?" The moment broke. Hannah stepped back, releasing Caleb's hand. "Of course, sweetheart. You can start a collection." They stayed at the creek for an hour, letting the children play until they were soaked and exhausted and happy. Hannah sat on a fallen log and watched them, and for that small slice of time she let herself forget about debts and threats and forged signatures. She let herself just be a mother watching her children play. When they finally loaded back into the wagon, Thomas and Lily fell asleep almost immediately, curled up together in the back. Caleb drove slowly, careful not to jostle them awake, and Hannah found herself studying his profile. The strong line of his jaw, the way his eyes constantly scanned the horizon, the quiet competence in everything he did. "Can I ask you something?" she said softly. "Sure." "Why did you really stop that day? When you found us behind the store?" Caleb was quiet for a long moment. "You looked like Sarah," he said finally. "Your daughter. She has the same color hair, same way of holding herself. For just a second, when I saw you three there..." He stopped, swallowed. "I couldn't leave you." It would have felt like leaving them all over again. Hannah didn't know what to say to that, so she just reached over and rested her hand on his arm, a silent acknowledgement of shared grief and the strange ways life bound people together. The peaceful interlude didn't last long. 3 days after their trip to town, Caleb was out mending fence when he spotted riders in the distance. Not 2 this time. 5. He dropped his tools and ran for the house. "Hannah, get the children inside, now!" She heard the urgency in his voice and moved immediately, calling for Thomas and Lily. They'd been feeding the chickens, and she grabbed them both by the hands and pulled them toward the house. "What's wrong?" Thomas asked. "Inside, quickly!" Once they were through the door, Caleb barred it behind them. He grabbed his rifle and moved to the window. "Stay back from the glass." Hannah positioned herself where she could see out. The riders were closer now, and she could make out Garrett in the lead. But the others, rough-looking men with guns and hard faces, were strangers. "He brought reinforcements," Caleb said grimly. "What do we do?" "Same as before. We don't let them in." But his voice was less certain now. 2 men he could face down. 5 was a different story. The riders stopped in the yard, spreading out in a loose semicircle. Garrett dismounted and walked forward until he was about 30 feet from the house. The other 4 stayed mounted, their hands resting on their weapons. "Hart," Garrett called. "Let's talk like civilized men." "Nothing to talk about," Caleb shouted back. "You need to leave." "I brought some friends this time, men who are real interested in making sure we collect what's owed. Now, I know you're handy with that rifle, but even you can't take on all 5 of us. So why don't we handle this the easy way? Mrs. Price comes out, we have a conversation, and maybe we can work something out that doesn't end with anybody getting hurt." Hannah's heart was pounding. She looked at Caleb, and he shook his head firmly. "She's not coming out," he called. "And neither are the children. You're trespassing. Leave now or I'll shoot." One of the other men laughed. "You'll shoot? You in what army, cowboy?" Garrett held up a hand, silencing him. "Hart, be reasonable. We don't want trouble. We just want what's ours. The children aren't yours, the debt isn't legal, and you're standing on my land without permission." Caleb's voice was steel. "Last chance, mount up and ride out." "You know what I think?" Garrett said conversationally. "I think you're bluffing. I think you know you can't win this, and you're hoping we'll back down. But we're not going to. We've come too far." He turned and gestured to his men. 2 of them dismounted and started walking toward the house, splitting up to approach from different angles. "Stop right there," Caleb warned. They didn't stop. Caleb fired. The shot cracked through the air, and one of the men yelped and dove for cover. Caleb had shot the ground right in front of his boots. "Next one goes through flesh," Caleb said. Everything stopped. The men froze. Garrett's expression darkened. For a terrible moment, the world balanced on a knife's edge. Then Hannah heard it. Hoofbeats. Many of them, coming fast. She looked out the other window and saw riders coming up the road from town. 6 of them, maybe 7, led by Sheriff Donnelly. Garrett heard them too. He spun around, and his face went from angry to calculating in an instant. By the time the sheriff and his men rode into the yard, Garrett was holding his hands up peacefully. "Sheriff, thank God you're here. This man just fired at us without provocation." Donnelly reined in his horse and looked around slowly. At Garrett and his men, at the house where Caleb was visible in the window with his rifle, at the scorched earth where the bullet had hit. His expression was unreadable. "That true, Hart? You fire on these men?" "Warning shot," Caleb called back. They were trespassing and approaching my house against my orders." "We were just trying to have a conversation," Garrett protested. "Collect a legitimate debt." "With 5 armed men?" Donnelly's voice was dry. He looked at Garrett. "That's quite a conversation you were planning." "Sheriff, this man and Mrs. Price are refusing to honor a legal contract." "The contract's under dispute," Donnelly interrupted. "Mr. Adams filed papers yesterday. Until a judge rules on it, you've got no business being here." He gestured to the men. "Mount up, all of you." "You can't seriously." "I can and I am. This is harassment now. You want to pursue this debt, you do it through the courts like civilized people. But you show up at this ranch again, I'll arrest you for trespassing and intimidation." His hand moved to rest on his own gun. "Are we clear?" Garrett's jaw worked. For a moment Hannah thought he might argue, might push it further, but then he turned and stalked back to his horse. "This isn't over," he said, swinging into the saddle. "Not by a long shot." "Maybe not," Donnelly agreed, "but it's over for today." Garrett and his men rode off, and this time they didn't look back. The sheriff waited until they were out of sight, then dismounted and walked up to the house. Caleb opened the door, still holding his rifle. "You all right in there?" Donnelly asked. "We're fine. Thank you for coming." "Doc Thompson saw them ride out of town, sent his boy to get me. Figured they were headed here." He looked past Caleb to where Hannah stood with the children. "Mrs. Price, you need to stay close to home for a while. And Hart, I'd suggest you don't go anywhere alone. These boys mean business." "I know," Caleb said quietly. "I'll have my men patrol out this way regular, but I can't station someone here permanently. I don't have the resources." Donnelly's expression was apologetic. "Best I can do is try to keep them honest." "It's more than enough," Hannah said. "Thank you, Sheriff." After Donnelly and his men left, Hannah sank into a chair, her legs suddenly unable to hold her. Thomas and Lily clustered around her and she pulled them close. "Are the bad men gone?" Lily whispered. "For now, baby. For now." But she met Caleb's eyes over their heads and she saw the truth there. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. That night, Caleb didn't even pretend to sleep. He sat by the window with his rifle and a pot of coffee, watching the darkness for any sign of movement. Hannah tried to rest, but gave up after an hour. She made herself some coffee and joined him. "You can't keep this up," she said. "You're going to collapse." "I'll manage." "Caleb, I have to." He turned to look at her, and his eyes were haunted. "If something happens because I wasn't alert, because I let my guard down for even a second, I can't live through that again, Hannah. I can't lose someone else because I wasn't there." Her heart broke for him. She set down her coffee and moved closer, putting her hand on his shoulder. "You're here now. That's what matters." "Is it enough?" "I don't know," she said honestly, "but it's all we have." They sat together in the darkness, keeping watch, and Hannah found herself thinking about how strange life was. A month ago, she'd never heard of Caleb Hart. Now he was the only thing standing between her children and disaster. Now his pain was her pain. His fight was her fight. Now she couldn't imagine facing any of this without him. The days that followed were tense. Every sound made Hannah jump. Every rider in the distance sent Caleb reaching for his gun. They kept the children close, never letting them wander beyond sight of the house. Thomas grew quiet and serious, his childhood slipping away under the weight of fear. Lily had nightmares every night. Hannah tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy. She cooked meals, washed clothes, told stories, but it all felt like play acting, like they were just going through the motions while waiting for the storm to break. The storm came on a Saturday evening, just as the sun was setting. Hannah was washing dishes when she smelled smoke. At first she thought it was just the stove, that she'd forgotten to bank the fire properly. But the smell was wrong, sharper, more acrid. She turned and saw black smoke pouring through the cracks around the front door. "Caleb!" He was there in an instant, and his face went white when he saw the smoke. He yanked the door open and jumped back as flames licked up the porch. Someone had set fire to the house. "Out the back!" Caleb shouted. "Now!" Hannah grabbed Thomas and Lily and ran for the back door. Smoke was already filling the main room, thick and choking. She could hear the fire crackling, could feel the heat building. They burst out the back door into the cool evening air, and Hannah kept running until they were 50 feet from the house. She turned and saw the flames climbing the front wall, reaching for the roof. Caleb was running toward the barn, and she realized with horror what he was doing. "Caleb, no!" He ignored her and disappeared inside the barn. Seconds later, he emerged leading his horse and the milk cow, driving them away from the buildings. Then he grabbed a bucket and started pumping water frantically. "Caleb, it's too late!" Hannah screamed. The fire was already consuming the front of the house, spreading faster than any one man could fight. But he kept pumping, kept throwing water, his face desperate and determined. Hannah handed the children to each other. "Hold on to your sister, Thomas. Don't let go," and ran to help him. She grabbed another bucket, and together they fought the fire, knowing it was hopeless but unable to stop trying. The roof caught. Flames shot into the darkening sky, bright and terrible and beautiful. Hannah's home for the past month, the place where she'd finally started to feel safe, was being devoured. And then she heard it. Hoofbeats again, multiple riders, and her blood turned to ice. They'd come back. They'd set the fire to flush them out. And now... But it wasn't Garrett. It was 3 of the neighboring ranchers, men she'd never met, drawn by the sight of flames on the horizon. They brought more buckets, more hands, and together they managed to save the back half of the house and the barn. The front was a total loss, collapsed into a smoking ruin, but the kitchen and the bedroom where the children slept survived. By the time the fire was finally out, Hannah was covered in soot and ash, her hands blistered, her lungs burning. Caleb looked like he'd been through hell, his face blackened and his eyes red. One of the ranchers, a grizzled man named Miller, clapped Caleb on the shoulder. "Saw the smoke from my place. Figured you could use help." "Thank you," Caleb said hoarsely. "All of you." "This an accident?" Miller asked, though his tone said he already knew the answer. "No." Miller nodded grimly. "Figured, you need anything, supplies, lumber to rebuild, you let us know. We take care of our own out here." After the neighbors left, promising to return in the morning to help assess the damage, Caleb and Hannah stood looking at the remains of the house. Thomas and Lily were huddled together nearby, Lily crying softly into her brother's shoulder. "They tried to kill us," Hannah said numbly. "They actually tried to kill us. They tried to scare us." Caleb's voice was hard as stone. "This was a message. What kind of message burns down someone's home? The kind that says they're done playing games." He turned to her, and she saw rage burning in his eyes, cold, controlled rage that was somehow more frightening than any explosion of anger would have been. But they made a mistake. What mistake? They pushed too far. Before, the sheriff was sympathetic, but it was just talk. Now? He gestured at the burned house. Now it's arson. That's a crime he has to investigate. And when he finds out who did this, and we both know who did this, he'll have to act. Hannah wanted to believe him, but she'd lost too much, had too many promises broken to trust in justice anymore. "And in the meantime," she asked, "where do we sleep? How do we live?" Caleb looked at the barn. "We have the barn. It's not much, but it'll keep us dry. And tomorrow, we start rebuilding." He put his hands on her shoulders, forcing her to meet his eyes. "Hannah, listen to me. They want us broken. They want us scared enough to give up. But we're not going to. You hear me? We're not going to give up." She looked at this man who'd saved her, who'd fought for her, who was willing to risk everything for children that weren't even his, and she felt something shift inside her chest, something that felt like steel forging itself in fire. "No," she said, "we're not." They spent that first night in the barn, huddled together on blankets that smelled of hay and horses. Hannah lay awake listening to the children breathe, listening to Caleb's restless movements as he checked and rechecked the doors. Every creak of wood, every whisper of wind made her heart race. She kept seeing flames in her mind, kept smelling smoke, even though the fire was long out. When dawn finally came, pale and gray, she rose stiff and aching. Caleb was already outside, walking through the ruins of the house with his hat in his hands. Hannah joined him, stepping carefully over charred beams and blackened stone. The front room where they'd eaten meals together was gone completely. The bedroom where she'd slept with the children had a gaping hole in one wall, but the bed frame was still intact, the mattress scorched but salvageable. The kitchen had survived mostly untouched, protected by the stone wall that separated it from the rest of the house. Could have been worse, Caleb said, though his voice said he didn't really believe it. Could have been better. He almost smiled. True enough. They were still standing there when Sheriff Donnelly arrived with 2 of his deputies. He dismounted slowly, his face grave as he surveyed the damage. Got word about the fire last night, he said. Came as soon as I could. It was arson, Caleb said flatly. Someone poured kerosene on the front porch and lit it. Donnelly walked closer, examining the ground. Hannah could see the dark stains where the kerosene had soaked into the wood before it burned. The sheriff crouched down, studying them, then stood and looked at Caleb. You see who did it? No. We smelled smoke, and by then it was already burning, but we both know who's responsible. Knowing and proving are 2 different things. Donnelly's expression was troubled. I'll ride out to where Garrett and his men are staying, ask some questions. But unless someone saw them do it, or we find physical evidence, they're going to get away with it, Hannah said bitterly. Not if I can help it. But, Mrs. Price, the law requires evidence. I can't just arrest men on suspicion. He paused. However, I can make their lives difficult. I can question them, watch them, make sure they know they're being watched. And I can spread word in town about what happened here. Public opinion carries weight. It wasn't enough. Hannah knew it wasn't enough, but it was something. After the sheriff left, the neighbors started arriving. Miller came first with his 2 sons bringing lumber and nails. Then the Johnsons from the spread to the east carrying food and blankets. The Hendersons brought their wagon loaded with supplies. Even people Hannah had never met showed up, drawn by word of the fire and the determination to help. By mid-morning, the yard was full of people. The men formed work crews to clear debris and shore up the damaged sections of the house. The women set up a makeshift kitchen outside and started cooking. Children ran between the adults, and for a few hours the ranch felt alive in a way it hadn't since Hannah arrived. Mrs. Miller, a sturdy woman with kind eyes and work-roughened hands, found Hannah standing amid the chaos looking lost. Come on, dear, she said, taking Hannah's arm. Let's get you sorted out. You look about ready to collapse. I'm fine, Hannah protested weakly. No, you're not. And that's all right. Nobody expects you to be. She guided Hannah to a chair someone had salvaged from the house. Sit. Rest. Let other people carry the load for a bit. Hannah sat because her legs gave her no choice. Mrs. Miller pressed a cup of coffee into her hands and then disappeared, returning moments later with a bundle of clothes. These belonged to my daughter before she married and moved to Denver. Should fit you well enough. And there's some things for the children, too. Hannah's eyes burned with tears that had nothing to do with smoke. I can't accept this. You've already done so much. Nonsense. What are neighbors for? Mrs. Miller patted her hand. Out here, we take care of each other. Today it's you who needs help. Tomorrow, it might be us. Throughout the day, people kept coming. They brought what they could spare: food, blankets, tools, lumber. Mr. Henderson, who ran the general store in town, arrived with a wagon full of supplies and refused payment. Put it on account, he said when Caleb protested. Pay me when you can. By evening, the front section of the house had been cleared and the surviving structure reinforced. It wasn't much. They'd lost more than half the building, but what remained was solid. The men had even managed to rig a temporary cover over the exposed sections to keep out rain. As the sun set and people began packing up to leave, Miller pulled Caleb aside. Hannah was close enough to hear their conversation. This business with those debt collectors, Miller said quietly. It's not going to stop, is it? Caleb shook his head. Don't see how it can. Not unless they get what they want, or we find a way to stop them permanently. What you need is a deterrent, something that makes the price of harassing you higher than the value of the debt. Miller glanced around, making sure no one else was listening. I know some men, former soldiers mostly, good men who've fallen on hard times. They'd be willing to stand guard here for a while if you could offer them room and board. I can't afford to hire guards. Didn't say anything about hiring. Said room and board, food and a place to sleep. For men with nothing, that's worth plenty. Miller met Caleb's eyes. Think about it. 2 or 3 armed men here would make those debt collectors think twice. After Miller left, Caleb told Hannah about the offer. They were sitting outside the barn, watching Thomas and Lily play with a puppy one of the neighbors had brought for them. The children's laughter felt like a miracle after everything they'd been through. "What do you think?" Caleb asked. Hannah watched her children, saw the joy on their faces, and felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her. "I think I'm tired of being afraid. I think I'm tired of waiting for the next attack." She looked at Caleb. "But I'm also tired of violence, of guns and threats. Isn't there another way?" "If there is, I haven't found it yet." His voice was heavy. "But Miller's right. A show of force might be enough to make them back off. Or it might escalate things even further." "Possibly." He was quiet for a moment. "Hannah, I need to ask you something. Do you want to leave? I could help you get to Denver, find you a place there. The city's big enough you could disappear, start over where these men wouldn't find you." The offer surprised her. "You'd give up? Just let them win?" "It's not about winning or losing. It's about keeping you and the children safe." He turned to face her fully. "I've been thinking about this, about what I'm asking you to endure by staying here. This is my fight as much as yours now, but you didn't ask for it. You don't owe me anything. If leaving would give you a better chance, no." "Hannah, no," she repeated more firmly. "I'm not running anymore. I've been running since Michael died, and where has it gotten me? Nowhere. Worse than nowhere." She stood up, her hands clenched into fists. "These men, they think they can just take whatever they want. They think because I'm a woman, because I'm alone, because I'm desperate, that I'll just roll over and let them. Well, I won't. I'm staying, we're staying, and we're going to fight." McCaleb looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted. Pride, maybe, or respect. "All right then, we fight." The next morning, 3 men rode up to the ranch. They were rough-looking but not threatening, wearing worn cavalry uniforms that had seen better days. The oldest couldn't have been more than 30, but his eyes looked ancient. "Name's Cooper," he said, dismounting. "Miller sent word you might have work for us." Caleb studied them carefully. "What kind of soldiers were you?" "Union cavalry. Served through the war, and then some. Got mustered out 3 months ago with nothing but our horses and a pat on the back." Cooper gestured to his companions. "This is Hayes and Rodriguez. We're good men, Hart. We don't drink, we don't steal, and we know how to handle trouble. The trouble here might get you killed. Wouldn't be the first time someone tried." Cooper's smile was grim. "We're not looking for easy, Hart. We're looking for honest. Miller says you're an honest man in a bad situation. That's good enough for us." Caleb glanced at Hannah, who nodded slightly. "All right, you can stay in the barn. We don't have much in the way of food, but what we have, you're welcome to share. In return, you help with the ranch work and you keep watch. Someone tries to start trouble, you help me end it." "Fair enough." The 3 men settled in quickly. They were true to their word. They worked hard during the day, helped repair the house and tend the animals, and they took turns standing watch at night. Their presence changed the atmosphere of the ranch immediately. Hannah felt some of the constant tension ease from her shoulders, knowing that Caleb wasn't alone anymore, that there were others who would stand with them. Thomas was fascinated by the soldiers, especially Rodriguez, who taught him to whistle and told stories about his childhood in Texas. Lily was more cautious, but even she warmed up when Hayes carved her a small wooden horse that she clutched like a treasure. For almost a week, things were quiet. Too quiet. Hannah kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for Garrett and his men to return, but they didn't come. Then, 8 days after the fire, Mr. Adams sent word that they had a court date. The hearing would be in 2 weeks before Judge Morrison in the county seat. "Morrison's a fair man," Adams wrote in his message, "but he's also old-fashioned. You'll need to make a good impression. Dress respectably, speak respectfully, and for God's sake, don't let Hart come armed into the courtroom." Hannah read the letter 3 times, her stomach churning. Everything would be decided in 2 weeks. Either the court would rule the debt invalid and she'd be free, or they'd uphold it and she'd lose her children. "We need to prepare," Caleb said when she showed him the letter. "Get your story straight. Make sure you can answer any questions they might ask." For the next 2 weeks, Hannah lived in a state of constant anxiety. She and Caleb went over her testimony again and again. Where had she been when Michael borrowed the money? Did she ever sign any papers? Was it possible she'd signed something without reading it carefully? "No," Hannah insisted. "Michael never showed me any loan documents. He told me we were fine, that the farm was doing well. It wasn't until after he died that I found out the truth." "And the signature on the promissory note?" "It looks like mine, but it's not. The way I form my letters, it's different. Michael must have forged it, or someone working for the lender did." Adams arrived the day before the hearing to coach her more thoroughly. He brought a handwriting expert with him, a professor from back east who examined the promissory note and several samples of Hannah's actual signature. "The differences are subtle but definitive," the professor said, pushing his spectacles up his nose. "See here, the slant of the downstrokes? Mrs. Price's natural hand slants slightly to the left. The signature on this document slants right. Someone was copying her signature but doing it right-handed when she's left-handed." "I'm not left-handed," Hannah said, confused. The professor frowned and looked at Adams. "Are we certain this is the right person?" "I write with my right hand," Hannah clarified. "But I'm naturally left-handed. My father forced me to switch when I was a child. He said left-handedness was improper for a lady." "Ah." The professor nodded, understanding. "That explains the slant. Your natural inclination still shows through in subtle ways. Someone copying your signature wouldn't know to account for that." "Will that be enough to convince the judge?" Hannah asked. Adams and the professor exchanged glances. "It should be," Adams said. "But judges can be unpredictable. We'll present the best case we can and hope for justice." Hope for justice. The words sounded hollow to Hannah, who'd seen precious little justice in her life. The morning of the hearing dawned clear and cool. Hannah dressed in the best clothes Mrs. Miller had given her, a simple gray dress with a white collar, respectably modest. She braided her hair and pinned it up carefully. When she looked in the small mirror, she barely recognized herself. She looked older, harder, like someone who'd lived through war. Maybe she had. Caleb drove her to town in the wagon. Cooper, Hayes, and Rodriguez stayed behind to watch the ranch and the children. Thomas had cried when Hannah left, clinging to her skirts, begging her not to go. "I have to, sweetheart," she'd told him, kneeling down to his level. "This is how we make the bad men go away for good. But I'll be back tonight, I promise." "You always say you promise," Thomas said, his voice thick with tears. "But sometimes promises don't come true." The words stabbed through Hannah's heart. She'd pulled him close, holding him tight. "This one will. I swear it." Now sitting beside Caleb as the wagon rolled toward town, she prayed she hadn't just told her son another lie. The courthouse was a 2-story brick building that dominated the small county seat. Hannah had never been inside it before, and the formal atmosphere made her nervous. Adams met them at the door and escorted them to a waiting room where they sat on hard wooden benches while other cases were heard first. Hannah could hear voices through the door, raised in argument, but she couldn't make out the words. Her hands were sweating. She kept wiping them on her dress, then feeling guilty for possibly ruining Mrs. Miller's kindness. "Breathe," Caleb said quietly beside her. He took her hand and held it firmly. "Just tell the truth. That's all you can do." Finally, their case was called. Hannah stood on shaking legs and walked into the courtroom. It was smaller than she'd expected, with rows of benches facing a raised platform, where Judge Morrison sat behind a massive oak desk. He was an older man with white hair and a stern expression that gave nothing away. Garrett was already there, sitting at a table with a well-dressed lawyer. When Hannah entered, Garrett turned and looked at her with a slight smile that made her skin crawl. "All rise," the bailiff called, though everyone was already standing. Judge Morrison gestured for them to sit. "Let's proceed. This is the matter of Jacobson versus Price concerning an alleged debt of $2,000. Mr. Kendrick, you're representing the plaintiff? Garrett's lawyer stood. He was a slick-looking man in an expensive suit with oil-slicked hair and cold eyes. Yes, Your Honor. My client, Mr. Jacobson, loaned the sum of $2,000 to one Michael Price, now deceased. The loan was co-signed by the defendant, Mrs. Hannah Price, and has not been repaid. We're seeking a judgment to collect the debt plus interest. Mrs. Price is represented by Mr. Adams, I see. Adams, what's your position? Adams stood, and Hannah was struck by how shabby he looked compared to Kendrick. His suit was old, his papers dog-eared, but his voice was strong and clear. Your Honor, we contest the validity of this debt on the grounds that Mrs. Price's signature on the promissory note was forged. We have expert testimony to support this claim, and we believe the plaintiff knows the signature is forged but is pursuing collection regardless. Judge Morrison's eyebrows rose. Those are serious allegations, Mr. Adams. Yes, Your Honor, and we're prepared to prove them. The hearing proceeded with agonizing slowness. Kendrick presented his case first, producing the promissory note and other documents allegedly signed by Michael and Hannah. He called Garrett to the stand, who testified that he'd personally witnessed both signatures and that Hannah had seemed perfectly willing to co-sign the loan at the time. That's a lie, Hannah whispered to Adams. I never met him before he showed up at the ranch. You'll get your chance, Adams assured her. When it was their turn, Adams called the handwriting expert first. The professor explained in painstaking detail the differences between Hannah's authentic signature and the one on the promissory note. He brought out enlarged photographs showing the slant differences, the pressure variations, the subtle tells that revealed forgery. Kendrick cross-examined him aggressively. Professor, isn't it possible that Mrs. Price simply signed the document quickly, without her usual care? That would account for these small differences, wouldn't it? It's possible, but unlikely. The differences are too consistent across multiple alleged signatures. This wasn't a rush signing. This was deliberate copying. Then it was Hannah's turn. She walked to the witness stand on legs that barely held her, placed her hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. Adams questioned her gently, establishing that she'd never signed any loan documents, that Michael had handled all their finances, that she hadn't learned about the debts until after his death. Hannah kept her voice steady, kept her eyes on Adams, and told her story as clearly as she could. Then Kendrick stood for cross-examination, and Hannah's stomach dropped. Mrs. Price, he said smoothly, you claim you never signed this document. But isn't it true that you often signed papers for your husband without reading them? That he would bring things home and you'd simply sign where he indicated? No, that's not true. Are you certain? Memory can be unreliable, especially when dealing with traumatic events like a spouse's death. I'm certain. Hannah's hands gripped the edge of the witness stand. Michael never asked me to sign loan papers. He knew I would have refused. Refused? Why would you refuse if your family needed the money? Because we were already struggling. Taking on more debt would have only made things worse. But your husband disagreed. And as the head of the household, he had the right to make financial decisions. He had the right to make decisions. He didn't have the right to forge my signature and put my children at risk. Kendrick smiled slightly. Your children, yes. Tell me, Mrs. Price, how exactly did you end up at Caleb Hart's ranch? A widow, alone with 2 children, moving in with a single man. Some might find that arrangement questionable. Hannah's face flushed hot. Mr. Hart saved our lives. We would have died without his help. I'm sure. But isn't it convenient that now he's so invested in defending you? One might wonder if there's a personal motivation beyond simple charity. Objection, Adams stood quickly. Relevance, Your Honor? I'm establishing the witness's credibility, Kendrick said. Her living situation raises questions about her character and truthfulness. Judge Morrison frowned. I'll allow it, but tread carefully, Mr. Kendrick. Mrs. Price, Kendrick continued, have you entered into a romantic relationship with Mr. Hart? No. The word came out too loud, too defensive. Hannah forced herself to speak more calmly. He's given us shelter, that's all. Really? A single man and a widow under the same roof for weeks, and there's been nothing improper? Nothing. Kendrick let the silence stretch, let the implications hang in the air. Then he nodded. No further questions. Hannah returned to her seat, feeling like she'd been filleted. Caleb's jaw was so tight she thought it might crack, but he kept silent. Judge Morrison called a brief recess to review the evidence. Hannah waited in agony, watching the clock tick by minutes that felt like hours. Finally, the bailiff called them back. Morrison looked out over the courtroom, his expression grave. I've reviewed the testimony and evidence presented here today. This is a difficult case, complicated by the death of the primary borrower and questions about the authenticity of the cosigner's involvement. Hannah held her breath. After careful consideration, I find the expert testimony regarding the signature to be compelling. The differences identified by Professor Whitmore are significant and consistent with forgery rather than natural variation. He looked directly at Kendrick. Furthermore, I note that the plaintiff has not provided any witnesses who actually saw Mrs. Price sign this document beyond Mr. Reed, whose testimony I find less than credible given his financial interest in the outcome. Garrett's face darkened, but he kept silent. Therefore, Morrison continued, I rule that Mrs. Price is not liable for the debt allegedly incurred by her late husband. The promissory note bearing her signature is invalid, and any attempts to collect from her or her minor children are hereby enjoined. He banged his gavel. Case dismissed. For a moment, Hannah couldn't process the words. Then Adams was gripping her hand, smiling, saying something about justice prevailing. Caleb's arm was around her shoulders, steady and strong. And she understood. She'd won. They'd won. Her children were safe. Hannah walked out of that courthouse into the afternoon sun, feeling like she could breathe for the first time in months. The weight that had been crushing her chest, making every breath an effort, simply lifted. She stood on the courthouse steps with Caleb beside her and Adams shaking her hand, and she felt tears streaming down her face, tears of relief so profound it was almost painful. Thank you, she managed to say to Adams, her voice breaking. Thank you so much. Justice was served today, Adams said, but his expression remained serious. However, Mrs. Price, I need to warn you. Just because the judge ruled in your favor doesn't mean this is completely over. Garrett and his employer may try other approaches. Be vigilant. The words tempered her joy slightly, but Hannah nodded. I will. We will. As they walked toward the wagon, Kendrick emerged from the courthouse with Garrett behind him. The lawyer's face was impassive, professional, but Garrett looked murderous. He started toward them, and Caleb stepped between him and Hannah immediately. You think you've won? Garrett said, his voice low and venomous. You think a piece of paper from some backwater judge changes anything? I think it changes everything, Caleb replied calmly. The law says she doesn't owe you. That makes this conversation over. The law? Garrett spat the word like a curse. I don't need the law to collect what's owed. One way or another, Hart, you're going to pay for this, both of you. Sheriff Donnelly appeared at the top of the courthouse steps. He must have been inside for the hearing. Reed, I suggest you move along before I find a reason to arrest you. Garrett looked at the sheriff, then at Caleb, then at Hannah. His eyes held a promise of violence that made her shiver despite the warm afternoon, but he turned and walked away, Kendrick following behind him looking distinctly uncomfortable. That man's going to be trouble, Donnelly said, coming down the steps. I'd keep those soldiers you hired around for a while longer. Planning on it, Caleb said. The ride back to the ranch seemed shorter than the morning journey, or maybe Hannah was just too overwhelmed to notice the distance. She kept replaying the judge's words in her mind. Case dismissed. Her children were safe. No one could legally take them now. When they pulled into the yard, Thomas and Lily came running from the barn where they'd been helping Rodriguez feed the horses. Hannah climbed down from the wagon and caught them both in her arms, holding them so tight they protested. Did you win, Mama? Thomas asked, his face pressed against her shoulder. We won, baby. We won. Lily pulled back to look at her. The bad men can't take us anymore? Never, Hannah said fiercely. They can never take you. The judge said so. That night they celebrated with a simple meal that felt like a feast. Cooper had shot a turkey that morning, and the women from town who'd heard about the hearing sent over vegetables and even a pie. They ate in the barn since the house was still partially damaged, sitting on hay bales and makeshift benches, and Hannah couldn't remember a meal tasting better. After the children were asleep, Hannah found Caleb outside, leaning against the corral fence and watching the stars. She approached quietly and stood beside him. Thank you, she said. For everything, for saving us, for standing with us, for not giving up when I wanted to." "You never wanted to give up," Caleb said. "You're the strongest person I know." "I don't feel strong." "That's how I know you are." He turned to look at her, and in the moonlight his face was softer than she'd ever seen it. "Hannah, I need to tell you something." Her heart started beating faster. "What is it?" "When I found you that day, I told you it was because your daughter reminded me of Sarah. And that was true. But it's not the whole truth." He paused, seeming to gather his words. "These past weeks, having you here, having the children here, it's brought this place back to life. Brought me back to life. And I realized something." Hannah waited, barely breathing. "I don't want you to leave." "We're not leaving," she said softly. "Where would we go?" "That's not what I mean." He turned fully toward her now, taking both her hands in his. "I don't want you to leave as guests, as people I'm helping. I want you to stay as family, as my family." Hannah's throat tightened. "Caleb, I know it's too soon. I know you're still grieving your husband, still dealing with everything that's happened, but I need you to know how I feel. These past weeks, fighting beside you, watching you be brave even when you were terrified, seeing you with your children." He stopped, swallowed hard. "I've fallen in love with you, Hannah, and with Thomas and Lily. And I know I have no right to say this, no right to ask, but when you're ready, if you're ever ready, I want you to stay. Not as a favor, not out of obligation, but because you want to, because maybe you feel something for me too." Hannah's eyes filled with tears. The truth was, she did feel something for him. It had started as gratitude, had grown into respect and trust, and somewhere along the way had become something deeper. Something that made her heart race when he walked into a room, that made her feel safe in a way she'd never felt with Michael, that made her imagine a future she'd thought was lost forever. "I do feel something," she whispered. "But Caleb, I'm afraid. Michael hurt me in ways I'm still discovering. He lied to me, put my children at risk, left us with nothing. How do I trust that again?" "You don't have to trust it. Not yet. Just stay. Give us time. Let me show you that not all men are like him, that some promises are worth keeping." His grip on her hands tightened. "I'm not asking for an answer tonight. I'm just asking you not to run. Not to disappear the moment you're legally free to go." Hannah looked at this man who'd saved her life, who'd risked everything for children that weren't his, who'd stood between her and disaster without asking for anything in return. And she knew her answer. "I won't run," she said. "We'll stay, and we'll see what happens." The smile that broke across Caleb's face was like sunrise. He pulled her into his arms, and Hannah let herself be held, let herself feel safe and wanted, and maybe, just maybe, loved. But their peace didn't last. 2 nights later, Hannah woke to the sound of gunfire. She bolted upright, her heart hammering, and heard Caleb shouting from outside the barn. More shots rang out, and she heard horses screaming, men yelling. She grabbed Thomas and Lily, pulling them down behind the hay bales. "Stay here," she commanded. "Don't move, don't make a sound." Mama, what's happening?" Thomas's voice was thin with fear. "I don't know, baby. Just stay down." She crawled to the barn door and peered out. In the moonlight, she could see figures moving near the house. At least 4 of them, maybe more. They'd set fire to something. She could see flames starting to catch. Another attack, another attempt to drive them out, or worse. Hooper, Hayes, and Rodriguez were spread out in defensive positions, firing at the intruders. Caleb was near the corral with his rifle, and as Hannah watched, he took aim and fired. One of the shadowy figures fell. Then she saw Garrett. He was on horseback, hanging back from the main fight, directing his men. And he was looking straight at the barn, looking at where he knew the children were. Horror flooded through Hannah. He'd lost in court, lost his legal claim, so now he was going to take the children by force. The fire, the attack, it was all a diversion to get to Thomas and Lily. Garrett spurred his horse toward the barn. Hannah didn't think. She grabbed the pitchfork leaning against the wall and stepped out into the open. "You stay away from them!" she screamed. Garrett saw her and smiled, that terrible smile she'd learned to hate. He pulled his gun. The shot that rang out didn't come from his weapon. It came from Caleb's rifle, and it hit Garrett's horse. The animal went down screaming, throwing Garrett to the ground. He rolled and came up with his gun still in hand, but now Caleb was running toward him, and Cooper and Hayes were converging from the other side. Garrett looked around wildly, realized he was surrounded, and made a choice. He turned his gun toward the barn, toward where Hannah stood protecting her children. "If I can't have them, nobody can," he snarled. Time seemed to slow. Hannah saw his finger tighten on the trigger, saw Caleb still too far away to stop him, saw the muzzle flash as Garrett fired. But the bullet never reached her. Rodriguez had thrown himself between them, and he took the shot meant for Hannah. He went down hard, clutching his chest. The next few seconds were chaos. Caleb reached Garrett and hit him so hard the man dropped like a stone. Cooper and Hayes had subdued the other attackers, and suddenly the gunfire stopped. The silence was almost worse than the noise had been. Hannah ran to Rodriguez, falling to her knees beside him. Blood was spreading across his shirt, dark and terrible. "No, no, no," she whispered, pressing her hands against the wound. "Don't you dare die. Do you hear me? Don't you dare." Rodriguez smiled weakly. "Had to, ma'am. Couldn't let him hurt you. Couldn't let him hurt those kids." "Caleb," Hannah screamed. "Caleb, help me!" Caleb was there in seconds, along with Cooper and Hayes. They carried Rodriguez into the barn, laid him on a pile of blankets. Hayes, who'd been a field medic during the war, examined the wound with practiced efficiency. "Bullet's still in there," he said grimly. "Missed his heart, but might have hit a lung. We need to get it out, get him to a doctor." "I'll ride for town," Cooper said. "Get the doc back here as fast as I can." He was gone in moments, and Hannah was left kneeling beside Rodriguez, holding his hand while Hayes worked to stabilize him. Thomas and Lily huddled nearby, terrified and crying. Caleb stood guard at the barn door, his rifle ready in case any of the attackers tried to escape or regroup. "The children," Rodriguez whispered. "They all right?" "They're fine," Hannah said, tears streaming down her face. "You saved them. You saved all of us." "Good. That's good." His eyes started to close. "Stay with me," Hannah urged. "Stay awake. The doctor's coming." "Tired," Rodriguez murmured. "So tired." "I know, but you have to fight, please." For the next hour, Hannah kept talking to Rodriguez, kept holding his hand, willing him to live. Hayes did what he could to stop the bleeding, but without proper medical equipment, it wasn't much. The blood kept coming. Finally, they heard hoofbeats. Cooper returned with the doctor, a gray-haired man named Carson, who took one look at Rodriguez and started barking orders. He sent everyone except Hayes out of the barn, and Hannah retreated to where Caleb was holding the children. "Is Rodriguez going to die?" Thomas asked, his face pale. "I don't know, sweetheart. We have to pray he doesn't." "I don't want him to die," Lily sobbed. "He was nice. He made me the horse." Hannah held them both, rocking them, while the sounds of the doctor working filtered out from the barn. Sheriff Donnelly arrived with several deputies summoned by Cooper on his way to fetch the doctor. They rounded up Garrett and his men. 3 of them, including Garrett himself, were still alive and coherent enough to arrest. Donnelly came over to where Hannah sat with Caleb and the children. "They'll hang for this," he said grimly. "Armed assault, attempted murder, arson. Judge Morrison won't show them any mercy." "I don't care about them," Hannah said. "I just want Rodriguez to live." "He's a brave man. They all are." Donnelly gestured to where Cooper and Hayes stood watching the barn anxiously. "You're lucky to have them." "I know." The sun was rising when Dr. Carson finally emerged from the barn. His shirt was soaked with blood, and he looked exhausted. "He's alive," he said, and Hannah nearly collapsed with relief. "The bullet nicked his lung, but I got it out and sealed the wound. He's lost a lot of blood, but if infection doesn't set in, he should recover. He'll need careful nursing for the next few weeks." "He'll have it," Hannah promised. "Whatever he needs." Over the next days, the ranch settled into a new rhythm. Rodriguez lay in the barn, weak but stable, while Hannah nursed him with a devotion born of gratitude. Thomas and Lily brought him flowers they picked from the fields, sat beside his bedside, and told him stories. Cooper and Hayes continued their work, and slowly the damage from the fire and the attack was repaired. Garrett and his men were tried and convicted. Garrett got 20 years in the territorial prison. His employer, Jacobson, was investigated and found to have forged documents in multiple debt collection cases. His business was shut down, and he faced criminal charges of his own. The threats were finally, truly over. As summer began to ease into autumn, as the first cool breezes started blowing down from the mountains, Hannah stood in the yard of the ranch and looked at everything they'd built. The house was repaired, even expanded slightly with the help of the neighbors. The fields were starting to recover, watered by the creek that had finally returned to its normal flow after the drought broke. The animals were healthy, and there were even a few new calves in the pasture. But more than the physical changes, the ranch felt alive again. It felt like a home. Rodriguez had recovered enough to move around, though he tired easily. He'd decided to stay on permanently, as had Cooper and Hayes. They'd become family, the three former soldiers who'd risked their lives for people they barely knew. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and gold, Caleb found Hannah sitting on the porch steps watching Thomas and Lily play. He sat down beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. "Penny for your thoughts," he said. Hannah smiled. "I was just thinking about how much has changed, how far we've come from that day when you found us dying in the dust." "We've come a long way," he agreed. "Caleb, can I ask you something?" "Always." "When you asked me to stay back after the trial, did you mean it? Really mean it?" He turned to look at her, his blue eyes serious. "Every word." "Why?" Hannah took a breath, gathering her courage. "Because I have an answer now, if you're still asking." "I'm asking," he said quietly. "Always will be." "Then yes." She met his eyes, saw the hope flaring there. "Yes, I want to stay. Not as a guest or someone you're helping. I want to stay as your wife if you'll have me. I want us to be a family, a real family." For a moment, Caleb just stared at her. Then he laughed, a sound of pure joy, and pulled her into his arms. "Hannah Price, you've just made me the happiest man in the territory." "Hannah Hart," she corrected softly. "If that's all right with you." "It's more than all right. It's perfect." They were married a month later in the little church in town, with the whole community in attendance. Thomas stood as best man, so serious and proud in his new suit that Hannah cried. Lily was flower girl, scattering petals with solemn concentration. Cooper, Hayes, and Rodriguez sat in the front row, three scarred soldiers who'd found peace protecting a widow and her children. The ceremony was simple, but to Hannah it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever experienced. When Caleb slipped the ring on her finger, a simple gold band he'd saved for months to buy, she felt something click into place inside her. This was what marriage was supposed to be. Not the desperate arrangement she'd had with Michael, built on lies and debts, but a partnership between equals who'd fought side by side and come through the fire together. "I love you," Caleb whispered as they walked back down the aisle, husband and wife. "I love you too," Hannah whispered back. "All of us do." The reception was held at the ranch, with tables set up in the yard and lanterns strung between the trees. People brought food and gifts, and there was music and dancing late into the night. Hannah danced with Caleb, with Thomas, with all the neighbors who'd stood by them. And for the first time since Michael died, she felt not just safe, but genuinely happy. As the evening wound down and guests started heading home, Mrs. Miller pulled Hannah aside. "You've earned this happiness," she said, squeezing Hannah's hand. "After everything you've been through, you deserve every moment of joy." "Thank you," Hannah said, "for everything, for believing in me, for helping us. That's what neighbors do. And now you're one of us, truly one of us. This land has a way of making people belong, if they're willing to fight for it." After everyone had gone and the children were asleep in their beds, real beds now, in a real house, Hannah stood on the porch with Caleb, looking out at the ranch that had become their home. "Do you ever think about that day," she asked, "when you found us?" "Every day," Caleb admitted. "I think about what might have happened if I'd ridden past, if I'd been too busy or too wrapped up in my own problems to stop." "I think about it too. We would have died. But you didn't. You lived. And somehow, out of all that suffering, we found this." He gestured at the ranch, at the life they'd built. Found each other. Hannah leaned into him, and he wrapped his arms around her. I used to think the West was a harsh place, she said, unforgiving and cruel. And it is those things. But it's also beautiful. It gives second chances to people who've lost everything. It takes broken things and makes them whole again. It didn't make us whole, Caleb said. We did that ourselves. The land just gave us space to do it. They stood like that for a long time, holding each other under the vast western sky. In the distance, a coyote howled, and the wind whispered through the cottonwoods by the creek. Inside, their children slept safe and sound. Tomorrow there would be work to do. There was always work to do. But tonight, there was peace. Hannah thought about the journey that had brought her here. The death of her husband, the discovery of his debts, the desperate flight west with her children, the collapse behind the abandoned store where she'd thought they would die, the stranger on horseback who'd become her savior, her defender, her partner, and finally her husband. It hadn't been a miracle. There'd been no divine intervention, no easy answers, just hard choices and harder work, just people choosing to stand together against the darkness, just the stubborn refusal to give up even when giving up seemed like the only option. But maybe that was the real miracle. Not the grand gestures or impossible rescues, but the small daily choices to keep going, to keep fighting, to keep believing that tomorrow could be better than today. Caleb, she said softly. Thank you for stopping that day, for seeing us when the world had made us invisible. He kissed the top of her head. Thank you for staying, for giving me a reason to fight for something again. Inside, they heard Thomas cry out in his sleep. Hannah started to go to him, but Caleb touched her arm. I'll go, he said. He's my son now, too. Hannah watched him walk inside, this man who'd taken on not just her but her children, her problems, her past. And she felt her heart swell with a love so fierce it took her breath away. This was her family now. This ranch, these people, this life they were building together in the middle of nowhere, under the endless western sky. It wasn't the life she'd planned. It wasn't the life she'd dreamed of as a young woman back east. It was better. Because it was real. Because it was earned. Because it was built on honesty and courage, and the kind of love that didn't promise perfection but promised presence, promised partnership, promised that whatever came next, they'd face it together. Hannah walked inside and found Caleb sitting on the edge of Thomas's bed, talking to the boy in a low, soothing voice. Lily had woken too and climbed into her brother's bed, and Caleb had an arm around each of them. It was just a dream, he was saying. You're safe. Your mama's safe. We're all safe now. Promise? Thomas asked. I promise. And I keep my promises. Thomas nodded and lay back down, Lily cuddling against his side. Caleb pulled the blanket up over them both and kissed each of their foreheads. Then he stood and saw Hannah watching from the doorway. They're good kids, he said quietly. They are. And they're lucky to have you. I'm the lucky one. They walked together to their own room, the one they'd built onto the house just last month. It wasn't fancy, nothing on the ranch was fancy, but it was theirs, their space, their beginning. As they lay in bed that night, Hannah's head on Caleb's chest and his arms around her, she thought about all the definitions of family she'd learned. Family was the people you were born to. Family was the people you married into. Family was the people who stood by you when everything fell apart. But maybe the truest definition was simpler than that. Family was the people you chose to fight for, the people whose lives became intertwined with yours, not through blood or law, but through shared struggle and shared hope. The people who saw you at your worst and stayed anyway. The people who helped you become better than you ever thought you could be. I love you, she whispered into the darkness. I love you too, Caleb whispered back. Now and always. Outside, the wind blew across the empty plains. The creek burbled over smooth stones. The horses shifted in their stalls, and somewhere a nightbird called. The ranch slept, peaceful and whole, shelter against the vastness of the west. And inside, a family that had been broken found itself mended. Not perfectly, perhaps, but strongly. The kind of strong that comes from being shattered and choosing to rebuild, from facing the worst and discovering you're capable of more than you ever imagined. Hannah closed her eyes and drifted into sleep, safe in Caleb's arms, in the home they'd fought for, in the life they'd earned. She had no food for Christmas dinner that terrible day when she'd collapsed with her children in the dust. But in the end, she'd found something far more valuable than a single meal. She'd found a feast of second chances, of new beginnings, of love that endured through fire and fear and came out stronger on the other side. She'd found a family. And in the unforgiving but beautiful West, that was the greatest gift of all.